you're running your funding program or your grant program as a marketing campaign and not as a thing to actually solve a problem.
If you're not solving a problem, you're probably enabling problems or you're creating other problems.
For 99% of projects that go for hackathons, they actually just die.
It was Einstein. If I had an hour to solve a problem, I'd spend 55 minutes thinking about the problem and 5 minutes thinking about the solution.
It almost seems like the decentralized nature of the governance has actually led to inefficiencies, right? So from the state of Web3 reports, you start to actually see this, there's actually a centralization happening and there's a lack of transparency.
I personally find let's bang them bang very problematic.
I don't think there's a correlation with type of decentralization. I think that decentralization brings possible benefits in achieving impact.
Hello, and welcome to the Governance Futures Podcast. I'm Eugene.
And I'm Jamila.
And this week we had the pleasure of talking to Mike Cooper, who's a senior researcher at Metagov within the Grant Innovation Lab and leading the Grant Impact Handbook project. So Jamila, how did you think the conversation went?
I really enjoyed this conversation just because I personally don't really know much about Web3, grant allocation, impact. So to me, it was insightful because I was able to ask all of those questions and his answers were very, very insightful. I'm sorry for repeating myself, but that's just the only word I can really use. And I also think there's so much overlap to what I was doing and I'm doing as part of my PhD research, as part of my work as governance facilitator. So it's very interesting because sometimes you think, oh no, definitely there should be no overlaps. Even if we are in Web3, it feels like it's very distant to what I do. But I encourage everyone who might not know much about Web3 grant allocation, might not be as interested in that, um, potentially entertain that idea of listening to this because I found it great. It's just so refreshing to hear people who know what they're doing, who are so knowledgeable, and they're so eager to pass that knowledge to. What about you, Eugene? What
For
did you
sure.
enjoy from this conversation, considering that you actually have a lot of experience working with Web3 grant programs and everything?
Yeah, I mean, what had me most excited to suggest Mike and have this conversation was really also stressing the importance, and I'm glad we got to touch on it, of this frame of impact beyond capital allocation. Because I think it's easy to say, like, "Ooh, I want to spend money. What do I want to accomplish?" And then kind of backing into the steps you have to take. But, Mike said something to the effect of, like, governance and impact are inherently intertwined. And that's not a framing that's frequently brought up about governance. That I think no matter what your view is in terms of the specifics of the type of governance system that you want to see, framing it through what is the ultimate impact? Why are we doing this in the first place? How is the world supposed to look different because we do this? I just think that that's language that like we don't get to use enough, that I haven't heard brought up enough in other DAOs. It's just not the place where you normally start from. And I think it can, on a longer time horizon, really help us reorient to why we're all doing this in the first place, which just gets me really excited.
Thanks to conversations like we had with Mike, I personally take away that there's so much potential and there's so many reasons why we should continue what we're doing. And regardless of the environment and regulatory frameworks and just overall general volatility that everyone experiences in the space from time to time, surely, I think it's very important to just continue working on things and not give up in all senses of the word. So, yeah, with that in mind, here's to our conversation with Mike.
Thank you for joining us today, Mike. Excited to have this conversation about the intersection of Web3 and impact today. And it feels like a very useful place to start with, what do you mean when you say impact?
Thank you for having me here today. I'm excited. As we've talked about, I've listened to the podcast and, you know, yeah, I appreciate you giving me the chance to be here today. So I think when we talk about impact in relation to governance, right? I mean, I think that, for myself, I started my career working with different bilaterals, multilaterals, and foundations in the international development space, right? So, like the World Bank, different, UN agencies, national governments, foundations, and things like that. And so, when we talk about so that's kind of my background. So when I talk about impact and governance, just kind of keep that in mind because I'm taking a lot of these lessons from the non-Web3 world and trying to integrate them into the Web3 world. So when we talk about impact and governance, governance has all kinds of different functions, right? And the ultimate aim of those functions is what I consider to be impact, right? So a lot of what we're going to be talking about today is, specifically capital allocation, right? Because one of the first things that we're working on, right, is improving the impact grant programs within Web3 ecosystems. And so if we're just going to talk about, a function of governance being capital allocation, it's the function of that capital allocation, the ultimate aim. And that is largely a product of planning. There always has to be some kind of planning, right? A lot of Web3 ecosystems have these visionary statements that the purpose of the ecosystem, right? Whether it's to improve access to different financial services and products, whether it's to improve or empower different marginalized communities, whatever, right? The impact of that Web3 ecosystem is the literal plan to achieve that ultimate vision for the ecosystem. And I emphasize this planning function, right? Because we see a lot of visions. We see a lot of kind of mandates the ecosystem is going to do this, but there's no kind
Yeah.
of plan to say like
Hmm.
this is or strategy. This is how we're going to do that. And you can't have impact without that strategy um, and measurement that
Yeah.
says this is how we accomplish the strategy. Here are the milestones we use to measure. Here are the actual empirical measurements. And so when I talk about impact, I mean that ultimate aim, the strategy to achieve the aim, and the measurement of that strategy and the achievement of the aim as a change in state, right? An actual change from A to B as a result of the implementation of the strategy and the resulting behaviors involved with that strategy.
And so if thinking of it, and let me know if this is not a reasonable oversimplification of that, but if oversimplifying impact as the change you want to see in the world and the plan of how to get there and measure it, I guess first off, is that a reasonable oversimplification or what is that missing?
No, I mean, you probably said it better than I did, to be honest.
So I guess if that's the case, where is usually the starting point? Do you start with the plan or do you start with defining what change you actually want to see in the world, regardless of what kind of specific program we're talking about?
Well, you start with the problem, right? If you're not solving a problem, you're probably, either enabling problems or you're creating other problems, right? And so an impact, if you achieve your impact, the only thing that should mean is that you alleviated a problem or a set of problems, right? Because that should be the primary purpose of any type of governance system is to mitigate different problems. And so, you know, you define your impact by identifying the problem you want to solve, unpacking that problem through different types of methodologies, right? There's all kinds of toolkits and methods out there to do it, root cause analysis and all kinds of, but essentially, like, if you're going to do a cause analysis on a problem, you get down to the root causes of that problem, and there's different kind of layers between that root cause and your original problem statement, right? And this kind of manifestation, how this problem rears its ugly head empirically. And so your impact should just be like, well, we alleviated the root cause of the problem, right? And then your strategy should just essentially kind of reflect your planning framework should kind of reflect all those kind of, layers between your root cause of your problem and the manifestation of the problem empirically, right? And the layers between that root cause and the empirical manifestation of your problem are going to be, your intermediate objectives within your
Hmm.
planning framework to achieve your impact. So if you're not starting with problem identification and analysis, then you're not really going after an impact. You're just kind of doing a thing.
Yeah, which I guess to put in the reality, to jump ahead to the reality of Web3 funding programs, that's you're running your funding program or your grant program as a marketing campaign and not as a thing to actually solve a problem. But I also, yeah, I don't want to get ahead of ourselves 'cause I know we're going to talk about the impact handbook and more about Web3. But to keep the flow going, I would also want to kind of double check. You have this background in aid development. You've worked with groups like USAID, RIP, and other international orgs. Um, when did Web3 first come on your radar? What was it about this space that made it appeal to you, given that's the realm where you were really focusing your career before that?
I mean, I think there's been an interest in Web3 in international development for a really long time because, initially when Bitcoin first came out, the idea of using blockchain for more what I call incremental tasks within international development, right? Whether it's using the blockchain to manage different supply chain logistics within international development is a huge issue, right? Whether it's getting food aid overseas, vaccines, different medicines, or whatever assets we're transporting, right? Remittances and things like that was one of the first kind of things within international development we thought of for using a blockchain. But when we started to wade into the space of, you know, decentralizing social impact, using different governance frameworks like DAOs and things like that, where because a big part of international development has been how do we better tap into the needs of local communities? How do we empower local communities to define and solve their own social impact problems? And how can we use international aid to facilitate that? That's where I think blockchain really started to gain more interest within the international development space because it's, there's a long history within international development of top-down mandated impact
Yeah.
objectives, right? And going back to how we define impact, we this top-down approach that we were using, kind of mandated what the impact would be on local communities, whether that impact actually addressed their problems or not, right? But what if we could integrate, you know, decentralized infrastructure to manage that entire process and empower local communities to do this themselves? That's where I think it really started to kind of the rubber hit the road for me, where we weren't just using blockchain as an incremental uh, tool, right? We could use it as a transformational tool and actually how we literally achieved impact.
And I guess as a last question for this context setting before passing it off to Jamila, was wondering with that recognition that so many, say, development programs or et cetera, have this kind of combination of, on the one hand, you want to understand the problem from the bottom up, what is actually being experienced by people. But on the other hand, you have the mandate coming from top down around what's actually going to happen. How would you characterize the development world? How much decentralization was there in defining the problem, in setting the strategy, in coming up with the approach?
I mean, I think it varies, right? I mean, I think that international development is not this kind of homogenous space, much like Web3, right? What we're going to talk about when we like later, we're going to talk about the use of evidence within Web3, and we definitely see variance between ecosystems on that. I mean, I think it's the same for international development. Before USAID was dissolved, there was always this emphasis, there was this big kind of localization agenda, right? Where it was this big emphasis on, more grassroots empowerment and things like that. the World Bank and different bilaterals have had similar things, but, generally speaking, they were not very successful just because I think that when you are looking at the foundational NGO, I mean, I think that the NGOs have been much better at tapping
Mm,
into this, empowering grassroots and communities to define and solve their own social impact problems. I think just because they themselves are less centralized, right? It's very difficult for big bilateral, multilateral donors that have so much bureaucracy and are very inherent to change and are very risk adverse to adopt that kind of approach, right? And in a way, it's very threatening for those organizations, right? Because their mandate is to do exactly what they're doing. So, I mean, I think that there are some NGO actors like the Greenhouse Grants Initiative and groups like that have decent. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm getting that name wrong. The Global Green Grants Fund, I'm sorry. They have a decentralized model at their core for their capital allocation and their grants programs. And so they're what I would consider to be more the gold standard in the development space.
interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, I really liked how you dissected root cause, problem, manifestation of the problem. I wanted to go back to a general culture of grant programs in Web3. I think for people who are familiar a little bit with the culture and landscape of Web3, they would know that there are a lot of projects, a lot of grant programs that fall somewhere between promises of access to financial products, empowering community. You would often hear things like, let's bank them banked, which I personally find very problematic, that statement
Mm.
alone, just to from the perspective of, are we actually promising what we can actually deliver? And my question is, perhaps I'm starting with a rather pessimistic note, but I'm curious to hear from you. What is that distinguishes Web3 grant allocation? What is that, apart from technological solution that can facilitate that positive change, what do you see radically different to, let's say, Web2 or just like ordinary charity, nonprofit work?
I think that there's been a lot. I mean, I think there's already been good observations and evidence from things like the state of Web3 grant reports and things like that that Metagov puts out, which has documented. And I think, you go to like conferences and you hear this all the time that, you know, generally speaking, it seems that Web3 grant making, despite these kind of statements about transparency and accountability, these benefits that should come from decentralized governance aren't actually there in a lot of ways, right? It seems like the decision making about what Web3 grant programs focus on, how they are awarded, how they are monitored, and the final, impact of the performance of those grants is largely centralized, not very transparent, and doesn't use very good frameworks for, or principles, practices, and tools for, identifying the need and measure and awarding solutions, which are your grants, and then monitoring the results of those solutions, which is, the performance of the grants. Um, and so I think that's pretty well known, right? Now, that's not saying that every ecosystem does this, right? I think there are some ecosystems that perform better and others less so, but I think generally speaking, this is the case. Now, we contrast that with kind of like gold standards and non-Web3 spaces for grant programs or capital allocation, right? So I think that there's all kinds of examples to take from this. Some of the examples, Eugene has mentioned that, we're working on this grant impact handbook with Metagov, and some of the examples we're looking at for that handbook are examples from, commons management, collective impact management, and different decentralized groups, consortiums like that that manage different types of common assets or have different types of capital allocation for a collective benefit or a collective impact. And they all have kind of standards, right? That they use for that they adhere to for capital allocation, for grant making. And those standards are something that we're really trying to bring more into the Web3 space, right? So there's been really great efforts by Metagov and DAOstar on creating data standards. Metagov and Block Science or others are now leading efforts around Koi Pond, which is creating standards for different types of knowledge products. And I think that, what that work enables is, improving the use of standards within the Web3 space, allowing for more comparability between ecosystems for performance and increases that accountability and that transparency. But I think the main thing that we really need is performance standards, right? Some of the, like how do we actually define an impact? What is required for planning for that impact? What kind of measures should we be using? What are the trade-offs in the different data? How should we be collecting data for these metrics and things like that? Right now, it seems within the Web3 space, there is, we are getting some standards used around, metrics and things like that that are starting to emerge. But they're pretty they're still emerging and they need a lot of work, right? We're not really seeing any type of measurement of performance on grants past outputs, right? So we're able to track things like workshops are held,
Let me
different,
actually ask a follow-up on this
yeah,
because
yeah,
I'm
please.
very interested on this connection. From what I'm getting, the success of particular Web3 grant program is very much tied to the impact, correct?
I would say that, yeah, I mean, the success of a grant program should be a measurable impact. There should be a measure that the entire community can see and assess themselves.
I'm curious where decentralization, how does it can like do you have any evidence maybe from your research with Metagov that would support that the more a particular program is decentralized, decision making is decentralized, the more impact there is? Is there any evidence that would support that?
I don't think there's a correlation with type of decentralization, right? I
Doesn't
think that decentralization brings possible benefits in achieving impact, right? So, kind of going
such
back to,
as
I mean, say
such
what?
as
Go ahead.
such as
Yeah, yeah.
which one?
So, I mean, I think that just the sheer fact that we're using a blockchain, right? Using a decentralized ledger, it creates all this opportunity for on-chain or measures being more on-chain and visible to
Mhm.
entire communities, right? That's the first obvious one.
Transparency, basically.
Yeah,
Transparency
right.
will be good. Mhm.
Transparency and improvement in count and accountability. Now,
Mhm.
again, like we are seeing that to this date up to the point of kind of like what we call output measures, right?
Mhm.
Um, we spent these resources, these grants were funded, these grants produced this many patches or this many workshops and things like that. But what we're not seeing is any type of measurement or very sparse measurement beyond that, right? That actually leads, kind of more outcome and impact measures. Now, like, and to your point, there are benefits that come with decentralized governance structures to achieving impact, right? But we're not really seeing that in the Web3 space. And there's no correlation between decentralization and the achievement of impact. I mean, now this is purely observational on my point. The point that I'm about to make is purely observational, but I would just say that given the work we've done up until now, it almost seems like the decentralized nature of the governance has actually led to inefficiencies, right? So from the state of Web3 reports, you start to actually see this, there's
Mm.
actually a centralization happening and and there's a lack of transparency. And a
Mhm.
lot of these benefits that we're talking about aren't actually materializing because you actually have paralysis in the governance, right? Because of decentralization, in part, right? I would say that, the paralysis isn't uh, just happening due to decentralization. It's also due to a lack of actual planning and structure to that governance and capital allocation mechanisms.
No, I'm curious and I'm very thankful for you sharing those observations as a person who works with Web3 grant programs. I'm just curious whether you see that as a problem or perhaps it's just a matter of what you manifest. If you come to the space claiming that the decision making of grant allocation is actually decentralized and there's no like just a centralized body that would decide who gets the funding, then it's one thing. And another thing is perhaps it's okay for Web3 programs and grants to just come out as, hey, we are a group of experienced people. We have money. I mean, it's a gross
Yeah,
oversimplification. I apologize, but we will use our expertise to grant whoever wants to grant. But at least it comes out as honest. Everything is still
yes.
on chain, but we just decide to do this thing in a very centralized way because we see it as more efficient. So, we don't want to play in this performative decentralization. So personally, to me, the problem is like I don't see a problem when project grants DAOs come out as well. DAOs, I don't think it can be centralized in a way, but like projects, let's say,
Yeah.
well, you know what, this type of governance works for us. So you either come join us or not. Like we're not forcing you. But I do see a problem when the project or grant problem trying to act as if it's a community-owned,
Yeah.
decentralized decision making, and then it turns out to be actually it was all theater.
Yeah. I mean, I think that, I think especially, and you still see this, right? In the early days of blockchain, and you still these debates happening around like, decentralization isn't a spectrum, it's nominal. It's either yes or no. And there's only one way to be decentralized. And, you know, there are so many different design variations of Web3 governance systems that can have all kinds of different types of decentralization, and we're barely scratching the surface, right? But,
Mm.
governance design requires evidence, right? Because your governance design should be built around what problems you're solving, right? And I think so I mean, you can be centralized. That's cool, right? You can have a centralized governance structure that still uses a blockchain to solve your problem, and you can be very effective in that. And there's nothing wrong with that, right?
Mhm.
The Web3 landscape, Web3 is just going to have a plethora of all these different types of ecosystems out there, or like we hope that there will be, right? But the thing is that there needs to be going to what you're saying, right? There needs to be some transparency and what those governance structures actually are. And I'm not really sure that we are there yet. They're not very defined, right? White papers and charters have a lot
Mm.
of open-endedness in them. And I think that even that in itself is fine because to a degree in some way, shape, and form, because you should have some open-endedness to some things because we still need to experiment and find out, right? But
Mhm.
experimentation requires evidence both to design the actual experiment in terms of what governance structure you're actually testing, why you decided to test that specific structure or whatever thing that you're testing, and what a successful test looks like, how you're going to monitor that testing. This all goes towards these principles and standards around measuring performance, creating evidence, and using evidence that we don't really have yet in the Web3 space. So going back to kind of like, commons management or, collective action models and frameworks. Again, you're seeing the same thing there, right? Some of those frameworks and governance structures and those groups are more centralized than others. There's different cultures and things like that, and they evolve over time. But I think the thing that is always the death knell for those ecosystems is when there is too much variance between what they're actually doing and what they say they're doing, right? Whether it's
Yeah.
Right, yeah, whether it's, the actual level of transparency or centralization in their governance structure or the actual impact they're making, right? They report a bunch of vanity metrics, but their marketing is talking all about impact, and they don't address the delta between the two.
So to ask a follow-up on that, I wanted to kind of get at something you alluded to, but I didn't want to interrupt the flow before. But this element of output, what is it, outcome output impact, right? In terms of understanding those kind of differences, and with what you're getting out of what problem are we actually solving? Because it seems so often in Web3 grant programs that the problem to be solved is defined in that kind of level one of result of like we want more TBO, we want more of a certain type of vanity metric, like you were saying. But the question I always try to bring up whenever I'm talking to grant operators and that comes up is like, but why does how does the world change because your ecosystem has more TVL? Like, what
Mhm.
is supposed to happen after you get more TVL? And it seems like there's a disconnect in that thinking of like, oh no, but we just need to grow the network and to be more than our competitors. Isn't that already the impact that we want? When in reality, it's like, well, no, that itself should trigger other
Mhm.
changes happening, which then leads to a bigger change in the world. So I guess the question here is like I know
Mhm.
with Jamila's question of there's the centralization decentralization element, and even there that's on like the design, the execution, the who's reviewing it, the which projects get funded, but there also is this fundamental element of what is a good frame of mind to have when defining the problem to be solved, when defining the what change you want to see in the world?
Mhm.
Because whether you're doing that as one person or as, a multi-thousand person community, if you're not doing that thing, it doesn't matter if you're centralized or decentralized, you're just never going to solve the thing because you didn't define what you want to solve.
A few things. I mean, I think going back to your first kind of statement on there's things in between outputs and impact that we're currently not planning for, creating strategy for, or measuring performance of, right? Um, we stop with kind of vanity metrics of outputs, but our marketing is all about impact, but we just don't have evidence. So yeah, I mean, I do think that, and it's not just within Web3, right? I mean, I do not want to phrase or paint this as just a Web3 problem because, that gap between outputs, vanity and vanity metrics and ultimate impact exists everywhere, right? Private businesses struggle with this. Everybody struggles with this. It's just that within Web3, we have what Web3 really does is it creates all kinds of different, what we call causal pathways to achieve impact. So we have a lot of different ways in which we can achieve impact. And so the only question is, how do we best generate the evidence for how to get to that impact for more collective learning? And like you talked about, Eugene, right? Like, network growth is the big one. Is probably the number one vanity metric within Web3, right? Because it's easy to measure, and there seems to be this natural assumption that if the network grows, then all these other benefits will accrue, right? Will manifest themselves as a result of a bigger, bigger network, right? More people on the network. But there's not a lot of thought of, okay, so for the problem that we're really addressing, if we are addressing a problem with a lot of Web3 ecosystems haven't really identified the problem or problems that they're meant to address. Um, there's not a lot of discussion of, well, who should be engaging with the network? What types of specific actors should be engaging with the network? What kind of actions do we expect from these actors? Do these actors and their resulting behaviors help to diminish the problem? And, so there's a lot of assumptions being made, right? And those assumptions, whether they are clearly articulated or not, are usually where most ecosystems fail, right? They grow network, but they don't achieve impact because a lot of the assumptions that they made failed to materialize. Now, in the non-Web3 space, there's all kinds of, like, again, going back to kind of more decentralized governance ecosystems with, like, commons management and collective action forums. um, they have methods where they actually articulate and state assumptions that they are making, and they monitor those assumptions actively, right? So they're not just monitoring the performance of actors in their ecosystems, they're also monitoring those factors that can influence their ecosystem. It was kind of like, yeah, the mindset around problem identification. And to be honest, I mean, I think that if we literally got problem, there's all kinds of toolkits and methods out there within for how decentralized governance models approach problem identification and problem analysis, right? But there's that old Einstein saying around, I forget it exactly, like, and I hope I'm attributing it to the right person, like 80% of the solution should be, thinking about the problem. And that holds true for this as well, right? Most of your planning and strategy actually comes from unpacking and analyzing your problem,
Yeah.
right? That's 90% of it. So if you're not
Mhm.
doing that, then you really are setting yourself up to fail.
Yeah. Real quick, the exact quote was, and it was Einstein, if I had an hour to solve a problem, I'd spend 55 minutes thinking about the problem and 5 minutes thinking about the solution.
Yeah, I'd say that rings true, right?
I remember our conversation that we had in our podcast earlier with Jen from Lido, and we were talking about AI tools, and
Mm,
we were just curious about what do you think about AI tooling that we see in the space. And I don't remember the direct quote, but she also said something within the lines that we have too many solutions. And she said we don't see that much demand for it. Although we do see many projects receiving grants or receiving funding for development of certain tools. And there are a lot of tools. It's just like not enough demand of people who would use
yeah.
it. And from my work experience at Scroll, I also can say that there are a lot of service providers that I came across. And in my mind, I was like, okay, this sounds like a great idea, but I actually don't understand how that would incorporate to what we're dealing with. And it's also very interesting because some service providers that I've encountered within like just 5 past years in crypto, they don't actually care about the problem so much. They're like, we have a product, it's cool because it's this, this, and
Yeah.
that. And I'm like, have you actually looked at what we do? So that is a very interesting point. But I wanted to maybe hear more about how you measure impact. And I know that there's no perhaps just like checklist. And you've mentioned before that obviously it depends on goals, it depends on what is that objectives, and there's also some easy metrics that you can just see on chain. Obviously, if you do have certain goals to onboard X amount of users or repos created, I don't know, transactions, comments, any of that that could be like easily counted. I'm also thinking perhaps survey, interviews, activity, but also more so like the long-term sustainability of a particular project. Did that initiative or the project survive after X amount of time after the grant? Did it attract follow-on funding? Because there are some evidence that, for example, 99% of projects that go for hackathons, they actually just die. And I'm curious to hear from your side, what is that like from your work a minute ago, from your professional experience? What are those metrics that we should be looking at in terms of how do we evaluate and measure impact?
Mm. So I think one of the things that we're doing with the Grant Impact Handbook is, we've created a manual that helps ecosystems plan out their strategic objectives and their ultimate impact, identify requirements for their grant programs, gives criteria and tools for how to correlate, you know, proposed solutions with identified problems, coming up with metrics that are being used, metrics that can be used, et cetera, right? So hopefully, the grant impact handbook helps somewhat in helping ecosystems plan for and measure impact in that way, right? But
So
there's a
sorry to
lot.
interrupt you. Do I understand it correctly? And full transparency, I haven't
Mm,
seen that handbook, and I would
mhm.
appreciate we will link it
We're
in
still
the.
crafting it, so no worries. Yeah.
Oh, it's not out yet?
No, it's not out yet. It's not going to be out for
Ah.
a few months, but we're developing it now.
Okay, so I'm part of Blockchain Gov research effort, and we co-authored and collaborated with Project Liberty on this like governance toolkit.
Hmm.
And very short is basically because I think every so often, researchers get approached like, "Oh, but how do I design governance?" And like, there's no single recipe, right? It just really depends what you put into that recipe, and the outcome would very much depend on what you put in there. And our
Hmm.
toolkit cookbook tries to address that. There's no like golden recipe. It
Right.
really depends on your objectives, or really depends on your like value system and what you want to see, what are the outcomes. And more so, like, don't be surprised that if those are the ingredients that you're putting in your pie, it's probably going to come out as this and not that. And you have to just be honest with yourself. So is it something similar to what you're creating in Metagov? They're trying to just basically create those like interpretations and basically provide that education to people that, hey, those things lead to that outcome, those things lead to that outcome. So, or are you
Yeah.
planning something else?
No, I mean, I would say, I mean, it's somewhat that, right? So essentially, what the grant impact handbook is attempting to do is saying, you know, we have all of these different types of grants that we can fund, right?
Mhm.
Here are the types of problems that these grant types are best suited for. And here's some measures you should be thinking about that others have used. And here are some measures that, but at the same time, we've talked about there just hasn't been a lot of impact measurement within Web3 capital allocation. And so we're also proposing measures and manners in which they can use to measure impact. But I think that, it's not prescriptive. I think it says, here's things that you should be thinking about, right? And here's some of the trade-offs involved. And so you mentioned AI, and there's this explosion of how we're going to use AI in this space moving forward. You know, I think that AI, generally speaking, one of the things that we need most in Web3 is better knowledge translation, data translation as a part of overall decision support, right? So let's assume that we start getting better at planning for and measuring impact, and we start to use AI in for different functions within, that life cycle, right? There's going to need to be the capacity within Web3 ecosystems to say, okay, here are the trade-offs involved with all these different kind of decisions you're making in regards to, you know, uh, this is the type of data you're going to use for this decision, or this is you know what I mean? And so I think that that's a function that's really missing within Web3, and I think going back to what we were talking about earlier in terms of how Web3 ecosystems have all kinds of different capacities they can use to achieve impact that non Web3 ecosystems don't have. The big one is, mechanisms. Um,
But what do you mean
the
by mechanisms such as?
so So, for example, like quadratic funding, right, is a new
Uh-huh.
type of funding mechanism that's being used. The Mechanism Library, or the Mechanism Institute, I'm sorry, is creating their Mechanism Library, where it's
Mhm.
essentially, listing out all the different types of modular mechanisms that can be used within a Web3 ecosystem, what they do, what their function is, etc. kind of a profile for that mechanism that gives kind of initial guidance on when and how that mechanism should be used, how that mechanism's been used in the past with like links to examples. That, in my opinion, this is just my opinion, is one of the biggest value adds of Web3 ecosystems is the ability to use novel mechanisms to achieve objectives, um, and to experiment with those
Right.
mechanisms. Now, again, there's that word experiment, right? You alluded to the fact that, Web3 culture is really driven by innovation and experimentation, right? But there's just not a lot of evidence that is informing that experimentation, or there's not a lot of evidence being gathered that captures the results of that experimentation and there's not a lot of decision support on how the results of that experimentation should be integrated into overall governance decision making on what governance should look like, what capital should be allocated towards, etc. So when we talk about things like AI and mechanism libraries being built, that mechanism library, really, we should get to the point where we're generating enough evidence that for each mechanism, right, there's just like this nice, you know, big piece of guidance that comes with it that gets very specific around, you know, these are the when this mechanism's been used, these are the results, these are the specific types of problems, this is how you should test the mechanism, in terms of protocols. For like I used to work with a group called, 3IE, and we used to create these things called evidence gap maps that essentially kind of plotted out like, all these different types of interventions and how successful they were to achieve different types of outcomes and the quality of evidence that is reflected in the performance of those interventions and achieving those outcomes. If we could get something similar to that, and correlate it with actionable guidance in something like a mechanism library, that's what I'm talking about in terms of Web3 performance standards that,
Mhm.
are roughly the equivalent of the types of performance standards we see in other ecosystems.
Thank you. And you alluded to the knowledge problem, and we had Professor Elereni join us in the past episodes, and she talked about koi point experiment. So perhaps you could maybe share with us any learnings or insights how projects such as DAOstar and koi point address barriers that you currently see, maybe projects or people who want to enter Web3 grant programs, or they want to make sure that it's as impactful as it could be. And that would be great to hear from you.
I mean, I think that a lot of the kind of building blocks are coming into place, like what you're just talking about, whether it's the data standards being worked on by DAOstar, or the modular knowledge objects with Koi Pond, or even the mechanism library by the Mechanism Institute, right? These are all things that I'm going to call them constructs to oversimplify, right? But these are all constructs that we're going to need to build our solutions for our problem solving, right? But it's very easy to create these constructs because there's just low barriers to their creation. So there's really nothing to stop people from just keep generating, you know, the mechanism library can get to be, whatever, it can be huge, right? And so the primary limitation on that library is the evidence to guide its use, right, in problem solving. And that's the thing that we don't have, because we don't have standards and protocols for testing all of these different constructs, whether it's a mechanism, whether it's a knowledge object, or whether it's, a data standard. We don't have the protocols in place to test them and to see how successful they actually are.
Sorry if I jump in with a quick question here. So I guess to like, let's say we wake up tomorrow, right? The impact handbook is out, Dow Star standards get, all these things progress to a point where there's enough legibility, which that's already a big leap ahead. But let's just say that magically happens overnight. Um, what has your experience been on the culture and willingness of groups to acknowledge the work that goes into this? I think I remember from a previous conversation we've had when you were telling me about the norms of how much the evaluation portion is of the overall
Mm,
spending budget.
yeah.
And, like when you actually tell that number to most grant operators, they're like, oh, I can't do that. Right. Like I can't
Yeah.
spend 10% of my money on evaluation. And so I guess what, because there's the technical part of what knowledge needs to be available to make it possible, but then there's the what actually makes people change or groups change.
hmm
What do you see as the main hurdles outside of the standards, the protocols? What else is going to be the biggest thing that needs to actually change for this kind of stuff to get adopted?
So I think when you look at the evidence for what are the enabling factors that drive good impact design, measurement, and adaptation within any ecosystem, right? There's usually a type of champion that actually has the ability to leverage change within the ecosystem to focus more on evidence use, evidence curation, right? Um, but even a champion, right? Like, the seed thrown on stony ground, right? There has to be some kind of culture within that ecosystem that, we talk about within Web3, there's this culture of innovation, right? Are we sure? I mean, like, I'm not really sure, right? Because, like, y you know, innovation isn't just building stuff, right? Innovation is building solutions, and if you're gonna call it a solution, it means that you have empirical measurement that that thing solved a problem, and I think that we just don't have that yet, so I do think we're talking about, shifting the culture where innovation just isn't seen as build fast, build faster, but test, right? And what all does testing actually involve? And so I would say it's, shifting the culture to promote evidence building and evidence use, um, really advocating and enabling champions within ecosystems that are pushing for it. And I think that when we talk about incentives, right?
I was
That's when
about
it's
to ask you when you
yeah,
were like
yeah,
champions who, push that. I'm like, let's talk about incentives. How do we
yeah,
create incentives that actually foster this desire to champion certain initiatives forward and, don't lead to this apathy or just this burnout or sensation that whatever I did actually doesn't bring as much impact as I thought it would?
yeah. So, I mean, I think that okay, so I guess if we're talking about like capital allocation or grants programs, right? You look at like what the Global Green Grants Fund does, you look at what Rockefeller does or Gates or any of the bilaterals or multilaterals, right? The funding comes with um, requirements attached for collaborative evidence building, right? Whether it's, hey, you have to report out on these metrics, or hey, you have to take part in workshops to talk about, they call them like failure festivals, right? Like what didn't work. Um, and so I think that it's a lot easier to create that incentive when, let's say, you have a champion that has achieved a stable foothold and can actually mandate this on grantees that they actually are required to do that, right? So, yeah, that's easiest. But you still have to deal with the problem of like, well, what's the incentive for the grant program to even adopt that standard to begin with? I think when, from my personal observation in the past, when there's just been an absolute lack of performance and the grant ecosystem or organization faces this decision of, we are not we're not achieving any type of return on our investment, and we need to make a shift, right? I think part of the problem with Web3 ecosystems is that there hasn't been this kind of financial pressure to improve capital allocation up until now, right? Maybe I mean, again, this is purely observational, right? I do not have good kind of empirical data. This is purely observational, but I would venture to say that maybe those pressures increase during, bear markets, right? But there's just not a lot of incentive at this stage in Web3 maturity during bull markets to really focus on evidence curation and evidence use, right? Now, the question is going to be once Web3 really matures and there's lots of competition between ecosystems and things like that, there could be more pressure. But now it's tough, to be honest.
And a quick question on, you mentioned the importance of having the internal champions who are interested in kind of pushing for this. I think another, unfortunate reality, and again, this is more observational, anecdotal as opposed to empirical data, but it seems as though those who are tasked with building and running a grant program are just not part of leadership. And so, like,
Mm,
in the equivalent of the hierarchical orgs outside of Web3, right? At best, they're mid-level managers. Like, they are definitely not the people at the top of the pyramid of the power hierarchy, so to say. So when it comes to your experience outside of Web3, how much does this kind of change start happening until you get someone who's in, the equivalent of a C-suite for these orgs being bought in versus have you seen actual successful campaigns where it's like, hey, we as an org might not care about impact evaluation, but it starts from
hmm
kind of the lower or middle parts of the org to truly propagate that culture. Because obviously we're smaller orgs, we have flatter hierarchies, but I have yet to meet someone who's the head of a grant program who's, like, has the seat at the table equivalent to the ED of the foundation or the C-suite
Yeah.
of the labs.
I mean, I think that it depends, right? I mean, I've seen some instances where I'm thinking of one in specific, there was this government agency. We had this massive capital infrastructure program in a variety of countries, and we were not seeing the results from those capital investments in infrastructure or different types of institutional building that we wanted. And we realized because there were a lot of capacity issues that we weren't addressing with the capital investments. And so we needed a grants program to, address a lot of these things that we didn't really plan for when we made the initial capital investment, right? And so then all of a sudden, the grant program was very important to the overall investment. Um, and so in that instance, the grant program leads, they were at the table, right? And so I do think that it's kind of this question of what is the role of how important is capital allocation to ecosystem success, right? I think is the primary question. Um, if and I guess my question would be is like, well, if it's not, then why have it? But I would also really question the uh, prominence or whatever the role that is assigned. If they don't feel like capital allocation is important enough to track impact on, then why have any type of capital allocation? Or you're just wrong in assessing its overall importance to your ecosystem. And I would say it's probably more the latter than the former, right? Um, now, and so then you would make the argument like, well, you should be, assessing its impact because it plays this role in your ecosystem, and that role is really important. Now, I but I also think when we're talking about, governance and what should be the design of the decentralized governance within the Web3 ecosystem, that's also an impact question, right? Because there's a lot of different things, you should be assessing governance performance. You should be testing different types of design features within your governance frameworks, right? So yeah, that would be my argument for that as well.
I wanted to go back to your point. I'm not sure, did I remember it correctly, Failure Fest, or how
Failure
did you
fests? Yeah, failure
Failure Fest?
festivals? Yeah.
Right. Which I actually think is so important to learn from our mistakes, to pass that knowledge, and to hopefully not repeat those same mistakes. And like you both, I'm not very close to the world of grants within Web3 or outside. So I do have a question to both of you. Um, I have a sensation that within Web3, well, we all know that everything moves on in Web3 at just like much higher speed than it does in the normal world. And I have a sensation that very often we also forget about some of the mistakes and we just repeat them again and again. And sometimes I'm like, why are we again in the same situation? Have we not learned? So I'm curious, what do you think about this passing of the knowledge of the mistakes and learning from the mistakes? And what are your observations when it comes to Web3 grant allocation?
I mean, I think Web3 needs an evidence commons. We're building all of this infrastructure to create functional Web3 ecosystems, but we don't have any type of reliable, consistent knowledge about how to make those ecosystems work the way we vision, right? And I think the dangerous thing is that we don't have standards and structures in place to kind of mitigate failures before they become catastrophic, right? And so you get a Web3 ecosystem, it's chumming along, it's completing grants, and maybe 80% of its grants are completed successfully, right? Quotation marks in terms of those vanity metrics we were talking about earlier. They all report positive vanity metrics, but the ecosystem just all of a sudden fails, right? We've actually seen this a lot. The point with impact planning, impact measurement is to de risk experimentation, right? To where you're plotting out a causal pathway towards success. You can measure your incremental progress along that pathway, and you can start to measure when you start to kind of lean one way or the right and you start to go off the rails. And it allows you to use evidence to take corrective measures before you just have your entire ecosystem fail, right? And so it's there's a big risk management piece to evidence building that we haven't really discussed. But the long, or I should say, the short response is we need an evidence commons, right? We need
Everything.
standards to
Mm.
create an
Mhm.
evidence commons so that people actually know how to use all these things that we're building.
Thank you, Mike. And Eugene, we know that you have a huge experience when it comes to grants within Metagov, Web3, and even before Web3. So curious, what is your take on this?
Yeah, I mean, I love the call to action around focusing on an evidence commons. That would be a beautiful thing for us to actually see have developed and put into the world. I think, coming back to what I was alluding to with or getting at rather with the previous question on the hierarchy and the power sort of there. Um, I mean, I've also talked to a lot of grant operators and managers and, even the people who are kind of who they report into. And there's this recognition of like, oh, we know this isn't working great, but it's kind of somewhat like at least we got a little bit out of it. And
Yeah.
so that's enough for us to not justify spending more on personnel to then actually work on solving the problem. Because
Hmm.
whether it's how do you justify funding the evidence commons, right? Like that's its own problem that is not unique to Web3, right? How many core like security primitives or tools just in the digital public infrastructure outside of Web3 are like one dude in a basement because they feel like it. And like what happens if that dude or gal disappears? And then it's like, oh, this whole core part of the internet is just going down. Um, you know, So that part does not feel unique to Web3, and nor does the other side of it, which again comes back to the people tasked with running and solving these problems are like, I have so many things to deal with, and I'm getting yelled at for the top of the list. So
Hmm.
this kind of stuff, which is nice to have on the bottom of the list, it's
Yeah,
just
yeah.
never makes it to the top because like I'm not gonna get fired because I didn't solve this part. I'm gonna get fired because I didn't grow TVL or I didn't have X amount of projects go through. So it does seem this disconnect again, and like Mike, let me know if this seems more endemic in Web3 than not, but it does just feel as though it's a common startup and capitalization problem of like the thing that the VCs and the people with the most pressure on them on like growth and performance just
Hmm.
aren't worried about impact evaluation. That seems like a nice to have when we're in a world of abundance and we can do all the nice
Yeah.
things that we haven't had time for, but it's just not like a top one, top three, top 10 business priority.
I mean, I think that in non-Web3 ecosystems, even decentralized ones, right? You've seen consortiums and collaborations around shared standards, principles, and even, repositories for evidence, right? Within like the collective action forum and, similar groups, right? They represent decentralized entities that were able to collaborate across the ecosystems, create the standards, create kind of a culture around implementing those standards, guidance for implementing those standards, and and their versions of what we're referring to as evidence commons, right? Learnings around how those standards are applied. Now, so I think we have examples, non-Web3 examples, even within decentralized spaces. But I think, yeah, Web3 is different, right? We know it's different. I don't have a perfect answer for what that evidence commons actually looks like or how it's created. But I think that we're approaching a space where, especially with the integration of AI tools and functionalities within all these different life cycles, where, you know, now that we've got, things like all these modular tools coming online, whether they're knowledge objects or data standards or, whatever mechanisms, the ability to create Web3 ecosystems has never been easier, right? Um, but we just don't have the knowledge to do so. So I would say that anything we can do, and I think that Metagov is in, and I think that's actually underlying the importance of organizations like Metagov, because when you do see evidence commons and standards and principles being developed in non-Web3 spaces, it is usually the action of somebody like a Metagov, right? Which is cross ecosystem, this kind of collaborative champion. Now, when you talk about funding, right? That's where it starts to get stickier, but there's no reason why Web3 can't do it. And I would actually make a strong argument that as Web3 matures, there's an interest, there's an incentive to do this, right? I, you know, I think we're also talking about timelines here, right? Where you're going to see a lot of ecosystems that, yeah, they're in this like startup mode and things like that. But even in that race to an MVP, right? If you're in startup mode, that in and of itself is still just a different type of evidence commons, right? There's going to be evidence in that that's going to be useful in that race to an MVP, right? Even if it's just principles, right? There's all kinds of things that can be in that evidence comments, whether it's principles or standards or more specific case studies around the use of different mechanisms, and it can be oriented to different types of ecosystems, whether they're DeFi or something or focusing on something else, and maturity of ecosystem, right? Startup to sustainable. But I think that we would all agree that decision making of any type that doesn't use evidence is at risk, right? And it's just a question of what type of risk are ecosystems comfortable with taking.
And unfortunately, I know time is flowing on by, and we got to start transitioning to our final portion of the quiz. before doing so, I did kind of want to offer you the opportunity to bring up anything we didn't have a chance to touch on in this discussion, or any kind of final words you want to leave before we transition over to the quiz part.
I mean, I think that maybe just on the last point about, what should this evidence commons look like, right? Because,
Mm,
you know, the evidence commons should in and of itself solve problems. And
there.
so I would just say that, you know, in the process of creating the grant impact handbook and beyond, we're very eager to talk to different ecosystems about, what decisions do you need to inform? What evidence do you need to inform them? And I think that that's the starting point for the creation of an evidence commons or whatever that looks like, right? What decisions do we need to make, and what evidence do we need to inform them?
And that could be a fun workshop somewhere around Dev Connect, as a lot of those folks will be together. But I'll follow up with that
Agreed.
with you offline. But to start bringing us to the next part, which is our wonderful quiz, where, as a reminder, I'll be asking you a series of questions looking for one word answers. Hyphens are okay, but one word answers. So the first one I want to ask you is, where do you think Web3 folks should be gaining more inspiration from or learning from?
Man, I'm gonna say commons, right? Because I just think that and I know that this is like Ostrom's
This is a lot
everybody's.
longer than one word already. I'm just
Oh yeah, yeah. I was gonna give an explanation of the one word. The one word is commons.
okay,
Think about, read about exactly, right? I mean, these are not new problems we're dealing with here. It's just that we have new tools.
for sure.
Yeah.
So then, looking at Web3 governance, the best idea you've seen in governance is,
Principles.
what gets you most hopeful about Web3?
I mean, I know this is gonna sound lame, but decentralization.
I mean, given who you're talking to, not lame at all. And
Yeah.
last but certainly not least, what do you see as the future of governance in one word?
Variety.
Oh, yeah, always interesting to see where people take it with that one. But yeah, Mike, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us and to explore this intersection of Web3 governance and impact. Yeah, I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Glamour.
Thanks a lot. I appreciate it.
Thanks for tuning in. The Governance Futures podcast is sponsored by the Scroll Foundation and produced by the governance team at the Foundation, Jamila Kamalova and Eugene Lebenthal. Any music and photos are attested in the episode description. Feel free to subscribe, leave a review, or share with a friend. Until next time.